The year was 1883. On the windswept plains of the Kansas Territory, the silence was a physical weight, pressing down on Eleanor Vance. Her small ranch, little more than a cabin, a barn listing slightly to the west, and a corral holding a few head of cattle, stood as a solitary speck against the vast, indifferent sky. 3 years had passed since her Arthur, had been taken by a fever that swept through the territory, leaving behind empty chairs and echoing spaces where laughter and quiet conversation had once resided. Grief had built walls around her, stone by stone, as impenetrable as the horizon seemed endless. Eleanor was 28 years old, though the sun and the hardship had etched lines around her eyes that spoke of a decade more. Her hands, once soft, were calloused and strong, capable of mending fences, milking cows, and firing the old Winchester rifle that hung above the fireplace. She wore Arthur's worn flannel shirts beneath her faded calico dress, the familiar fabric, a meager comfort against the biting wind and the gnawing loneliness. Her days were a monotonous rhythm dictated by the needs of the animals and the relentless demands of the land. Up before dawn, chores until dusk, a meager supper eaten in silence, then the long, empty hours until sleep offered a brief, fitful escape. There was no room for softness, no space for the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. She had buried Arthur beside the lone cottonwood tree near the creek bed, its branches now bare against the autumn sky, mirroring the stark landscape of her heart. She rarely saw another soul. The nearest town, Harmony Creek, was a day's hard ride away, and she only ventured there for supplies every few months. The townsfolk, wrapped in their own lives and judgments, offered little solace. A lone woman running a ranch was an anomaly, an object of pity for some, suspicion for others. Most left her alone, respecting the invisible boundary her grief and stoicism created. She preferred it that way. Connection felt too dangerous, too fragile, another thing to be lost. The wind was her constant companion, whispering secrets she couldn't understand, howling like a thing grieving alongside her. It whipped dust devils across the yard in the summer and piled snowdrifts against the cabin in the winter. On this particular afternoon, the wind carried the scent of an approaching storm. The sky, a moment ago, a pale, washed-out blue, was bruising into a deep, ominous purple on the western horizon. Distant thunder rumbled like the growl of a restless beast. Eleanor hurried to finish her chores, the urgency of the coming weather adding a rare flicker of energy to her movements. She checked the barn door latches, ensured the chickens were secure, and tossed extra hay into the corral. As she straightened up, wiping a strand of hair from her eyes with the back of a gloved hand, she saw it. A dark shape against the rapidly darkening sky, a lone rider, struggling against the wind. He was moving slowly, erratically, as if fighting for control of his horse. The animal looked spooked, head down, mane whipping wildly. As they drew closer, she saw the rider slump forward in the saddle. He wasn't just battling the storm, he was injured, or worse. Her first instinct was to retreat indoors, bolt the door, and pretend she hadn't seen him. He was a stranger, and strangers out here often meant trouble. This land, while vast and beautiful, could also be brutal, attracting those who lived on the fringes of society, seeking to take what others had worked so hard to build. The rifle by the fireplace felt suddenly heavy in her mind. But the rider wasn't heading directly for the cabin. He seemed to be trying to reach the barn for shelter, his horse veering towards it with a last surge of strength. Just yards from the barn door, the horse stumbled, pitching the rider to the ground. He lay still in the swirling dust and debris. The horse, freed, bolted, disappearing into the deepening gloom. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment longer. The wind shrieked around the cabin corners. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splashing against the dry earth. He was just a shape, a man, vulnerable and alone under a hostile sky. It was the way Arthur would have seen it, the way Arthur would have acted. A wave of that familiar ache, sharp and sudden, pierced through her carefully constructed walls. She grabbed a lantern from the porch and a worn blanket from inside the cabin. Pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, she stepped out into the rising storm. The wind snatched at her clothes, pulling at her hair. She fought her way towards the still figure on the ground. He lay face down, one arm twisted beneath him. As she knelt beside him, carefully rolling him onto his back, the dim light of the lantern illuminated his face. He was young, perhaps early 30s, with a hard jawline partially obscured by a few days' growth of beard. His skin was pale, etched with lines of pain even in unconsciousness. There was a dark stain spreading across his left side, blooming crimson against the rough fabric of his shirt, a bullet wound. Fear, cold and sharp, replaced the flicker of compassion. Who was he? Who had shot him? Was someone following him? She glanced around wildly, straining her eyes against the driving rain and the encroaching darkness, but saw only the empty prairie. Still, she couldn't leave him there, not in the storm. Not wounded like this. He was heavy, a dead weight. Eleanor gritted her teeth, wrapping her arms around his chest and pulling, dragging him slowly towards the barn. The rain was coming down in sheets now, plastering her hair to her face, soaking her clothes. It felt like wrestling with a sack of stones, every inch a struggle against the mud and the slope of the ground. She pulled until her muscles screamed, until her lungs burned, until the barn door was just ahead. Getting him inside was another ordeal. She managed to prop him against the frame, heave his legs over the threshold, and then, with a final desperate tug, pulled the rest of him onto the relative dryness of the barn floor. She slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the sudden, albeit damp, quiet. She knelt beside him again, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. His breathing was shallow, ragged. The wound looked bad. She had some rudimentary medical supplies in the cabin, bandages, antiseptic, carbolic acid diluted in water, as Arthur had taught her. Not much, but maybe enough to stop the bleeding. Leaving him for a moment, she ran back to the cabin, retrieved the supplies, and returned to the barn. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, cutting away the soaked fabric around the wound. It was a clean shot, mercifully, straight through, but it was deep. She cleaned it as best she could, the man groaning softly at her touch, his brow furrowed in pain. She packed the wound with clean cloth and bandaged it tightly, her movements practiced and steady despite her inner turmoil. He was still unconscious when she finished. She covered him with the blanket she had brought and sat back on her heels, watching him. Who was this man? He wasn't dressed like a drifter. His clothes, though muddy and torn now, were of decent quality. He had a worn leather satchel tied to his saddle horn. If his horse hadn't bolted, perhaps she would have found something there. But the horse was gone, a phantom in the storm. She couldn't leave him here on the cold floor. With renewed effort, she dragged him towards the back of the barn where she kept her spare hay. She piled the fragrant straw high, creating a makeshift bed, and carefully rolled him onto it. He seemed slightly more comfortable, his breathing still ragged but perhaps a little less strained. Eleanor sat beside him for a long time, listening to the pounding rain on the barn roof and the groan of the wind outside. Her own clothes were damp and cold, but she didn't notice. Her mind raced. Should she ride to Harmony Creek for help? The storm made that impossible tonight, and his condition seemed too fragile to wait. She was alone, responsible for a wounded stranger. The isolation that had once been a shield now felt like a cage. She fell into a restless doze leaning against a support beam, the lantern flickering low. When she woke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a chilled, clean silence. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in soft hues of rose and gold. The man was awake, his eyes open, watching her with a mixture of pain and confusion. His eyes were a startling clear blue. They held a depth she couldn't immediately decipher, a guardedness that mirrored her own. "Where?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. "My ranch," Eleanor said, her voice rough from sleep and disuse. "You were hurt, caught in the storm." He tried to push himself up, but a sharp intake of breath and a grimace of pain stopped him. He sank back into the hay. "Shot," he mumbled, touching his bandaged side. "Yes," she confirmed. "I cleaned it. It needs looking at properly, but the storm and the nearest town is a day away." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady on her face. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little stronger. "Didn't think." He trailed off, a shadow passing over his eyes. "Who?" she started, then stopped herself. It wasn't her place to ask. "Jasper," he supplied, sensing her unspoken question. "Jasper Shaw. Eleanor Vance." Just Eleanor. Silence settled between them again, less tense than the night before, but still heavy with the unknown. He was Jasper Shaw. He had been shot. He was here, on her ranch. and his presence had already cracked the solid wall of her routine, allowing in both the chill of uncertainty and a faint, almost imperceptible draft of something else. The next few days were a test of wills and practicalities. Jasper was weak, unable to move much. Eleanor tended his wound, changing the bandages carefully. She brought him water and what little food she had, mostly dried jerky and hardtack, supplemented by fresh milk from her cow. Dialogue was minimal, functional. Need water. Here. Hurts. I know. He watched her constantly with those startling blue eyes. She felt his gaze even when her back was turned, a physical presence she hadn't felt in years. It was unsettling, yet also something else. A reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. He didn't offer explanations, and she didn't ask. His silence was as guarded as hers. It was clear he was running from something, or someone. The wound was proof enough of that. She chose not to pry. His past was his own. Her focus was on the immediate future, keeping him alive, keeping herself safe, and figuring out what to do when he was strong enough to leave. As he slowly regained strength, Jasper began to observe her routine. He saw the hard work, the isolation, the quiet efficiency with which she ran the ranch by herself. He saw the tired lines around her eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders when she thought she was alone. One afternoon, while she was struggling to lift a heavy feed sack, he spoke. "Let me," he said, his voice still a little weak but firm. Eleanor paused, surprised. She hadn't expected him to offer, or even to be able to. "You're not strong enough," she said, perhaps a little too quickly, pride and years of independence making the words sharp. "Strong enough for that," he insisted, pushing himself up slowly from his haybed. He moved stiffly, wincing slightly, but he made his way over to the sack and hoisted it onto his shoulder with a quiet grunt. He carried it to the feed trough and emptied it. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. It was the first time he had actively participated in the life of the ranch, the first time he had offered help without being asked. Eleanor found herself watching him, a strange warmth stirring in her chest. From that day on, as he grew stronger, Jasper began to do more. He fixed the listing barn door, his movements economical and skilled. He mended a section of fence that had been down for weeks. He helped with the milking, his hands surprisingly gentle. He didn't talk much while they worked, the silence between them shifting from wary to companionable. It was a shared silence, filled with the sounds of their tasks, the lowing of the cattle, the ever-present wind. Eleanor began to talk, tentatively at first. About the ranch, about the weather, about the difficulties of being alone. She didn't speak of Arthur directly, not at first, but she spoke of the way things used to be, the challenges she faced now that she faced them alone. Jasper listened, his blue eyes steady, offering quiet affirmations or practical suggestions when needed. One evening, sitting by the small fire in the cabin, she had moved him from the barn once he was able to walk. She finally spoke his name aloud, not in a question, but a statement. "Jasper." He looked up from whittling a small piece of wood into a smooth, unidentifiable shape. "Eleanor." "You were shot," she said, the words hanging in the air. He paused, his knife still. He looked into the flames for a long moment. "Yes." "Why?" He sighed, a quiet, weary sound. "Trouble," he said simply. "Not of my making, not entirely. Just got caught up." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. But the small admission felt like a gift, a sliver of trust offered in the vastness of his guardedness. She offered a sliver back. "My husband," she said, her voice soft, fragile, "Arthur, died of fever 3 years ago." Jasper looked at her, his gaze full of unexpected understanding. He didn't offer platitudes, didn't say he was sorry, he just nodded, his eyes conveying a shared knowledge of pain, of absence. "It's quiet," he said after a while, looking around the small cabin. "Too quiet," she admitted, the words aching in her throat, since he left." "Sometimes," Jasper said, turning back to his whittling, "quiet is a mercy, sometimes it's a weight." Eleanor looked at this man, this stranger who had arrived bleeding on her land, and felt a connection she hadn't expected, hadn't dared to hope for. He understood the weight of silence, the burden of absence. He didn't try to fill it with empty chatter, he simply sat with it, acknowledged it. Their bond grew in these quiet moments, in shared glances over the fire, in the rhythm of their work side by side. He was competent, steady, reliable. He anticipated her needs, taking on tasks without being asked. He fixed things she hadn't even realized were broken: a loose step on the porch, a leaky bucket, the sticking latch on the chicken coop. He brought a quiet strength to the ranch, a sense of shared burden that lightened her load in ways she hadn't thought possible. She, in turn, saw past his guardedness, the lines of pain and weariness on his face. She saw the kindness in his eyes when he looked at her cattle, the focused patience in his hands when he worked. She saw a man carrying his own burdens, his own past, with a quiet dignity. The initial fear she'd felt dissolved, replaced by a growing respect and something warmer, something akin to affection. One afternoon, after they'd finished mending a long stretch of fence, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in hues of orange and pink. It was the first time they had sat together doing nothing, simply sharing the end of the day. "You could stay," Eleanor said, the words surprising her as they left her lips. Jasper turned his head slowly, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Stay?" "Here," she clarified, gesturing around the ranch. "The work, it's too much for one person. And the quiet." She trailed off, feeling suddenly vulnerable. He looked out at the vast, empty land, then back at her. His expression was unreadable. "My past," he began, then stopped. "Everyone has a past, Jasper," she said gently. "Some just weigh heavier than others." He held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw not just the pain and the secrets, but a deep longing, a weariness that went soul deep. I appreciate the offer, Eleanor, more than you know." He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. The possibility hung between them, fragile and unspoken. Their quiet life together, built on shared work and unspoken understanding, didn't escape the notice of the nearest neighbors, sparse as they were. Word traveled slowly but surely to Harmony Creek. A strange man was living out at the Vance place. A lone woman, taking in a drifter. Whispers turned to gossip, gossip to judgment. Caleb McBride was a man who liked order. He was the unofficial leader of Harmony Creek, a self-appointed guardian of its morals and safety. He owned the general store, held the keys to the community's purse strings, and wielded significant influence through his booming voice and unwavering certainty in his own righteousness. He had always viewed Eleanor with a mixture of pity and suspicion, pity for her widowhood, suspicion for her independence. Her decision to take in a wounded stranger, a man with no name or history they knew, was an affront to his sense of order and propriety. One morning, a few weeks after Jasper had arrived and was clearly on the mend, a wagon rattled down the track leading to Eleanor's ranch. It carried Caleb McBride, his face set in a stern, disapproving mask, and two other men, looking uncomfortable but determined. Eleanor saw them coming from a distance. Her stomach tightened. She felt a flicker of the old fear, the vulnerability she had tried to bury. Jasper stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression hardening as he recognized the intent in the approaching figures. Caleb McBride reined in his team a respectful distance from the cabin porch, but his voice carried clearly on the wind. "Eleanor, we need a word." Eleanor walked to the edge of the porch, standing straight, her chin lifted. Jasper moved to stand beside her, a silent, formidable presence. His hand rested casually near where she knew he kept a knife hidden in his boot. "Mornin', Caleb," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "What brings you all this way?" Caleb ignored the greeting, his gaze fixed on Jasper. "We heard you got a guest, Eleanor, a stranger, injured." "He needed help," Eleanor stated simply. "Came in during the storm." "Help from what?" Caleb pressed, his voice booming. "And who is he?" "The folks in town are talking, Eleanor. They're saying you've taken in some outlaw. Someone running from the law, someone dangerous." Jasper stepped forward slightly. "I'm Jasper Shaw," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "And I'm not running from the law. Just trouble." Caleb snorted. "Trouble and the law often ride the same trail, mister. We think you ought to come back to town with us, answer some questions, for the safety of the community." Eleanor's gaze flicked from Caleb to the two men with him, then back to Jasper. His face was unreadable, but she felt the tension radiating from him. The bond they had forged in the quiet solitude of the ranch was being tested, exposed to the harsh glare of outside judgment and suspicion. "He's not going anywhere," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He's under my roof. He needed help, and I gave it. That's all there is to it." "That's not all there is to it, Eleanor," Caleb insisted, leaning forward in his wagon seat. "A man with a bullet hole ain't just trouble, he's likely a criminal. It's your duty to report him, to turn him over." "My duty," Eleanor said, her eyes flashing, "is to decide who I shelter on my own property. He's done no harm here. He's helped me. He's earned his keep." Caleb's face darkened. "Helped you? Or taken advantage of a lonely woman? People are talking about that too, Eleanor. A woman alone. It ain't right, him buying here." The implication hung in the air, ugly and unfounded. Jasper's hand tightened into a fist at his side. Eleanor felt a surge of protectiveness, fierce and unexpected, rise within her. It wasn't just about Jasper anymore. It was about her own independence, her right to choose, her refusal to bow to their narrow-minded judgment. "Get off my land, Caleb," Eleanor said, her voice low and steady, holding his gaze. "And don't come back unless you're invited." Caleb looked taken aback by her defiance. He had expected her to be cowed, perhaps intimidated by the presence of the men with him. He glanced at Jasper, who stood silent and still, his gaze unwavering, emanating a quiet warning that was more potent than any shout. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor," Caleb said, his voice losing some of its bluster, replaced by a resentful edge. "Harboring a fugitive, you'll see, trouble follows men like him, and it'll find you here." He flicked the reins, turning the wagon. The two men with him looked relieved, avoiding eye contact. Caleb McBride drove away, leaving behind a lingering tension that settled over the ranch like dust. Eleanor watched them go, her body trembling slightly with the aftermath of the confrontation. She had stood her ground. She had defended Jasper. And in doing so, she had burned the last bridge to the meager, judgmental society of Harmony Creek. She turned to look at Jasper. He was watching her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, a flicker of something softened his eyes. Respect? Gratitude? "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice quiet. "Yes, I did," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze squarely. "They had no right, and you needed help." He stepped closer, reaching out hesitantly, then resting his hand lightly on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her, other than when she was tending his wound. The touch was warm, gentle, grounding. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for everything." In that moment, the last of the walls around Eleanor's heart crumbled. This man, this stranger, had offered her silent companionship, reliable help, and now, a quiet gratitude that felt more valuable than gold. His presence had brought conflict, yes, but it had also brought a sense of purpose, a reason to stand strong, and a connection that eased the crushing weight of her solitude. The confrontation with Caleb McBride marked a turning point. While it solidified Eleanor's isolation from the town, it deepened the bond between her and Jasper immeasurably. They were a unit now, set apart from the rest of the world by their shared experience and Eleanor's defiant choice. Jasper's recovery accelerated. With his strength returned, he became an indispensable partner on the ranch. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, their movements synchronized, their silence comfortable and full. He took on the heavier tasks, fixing the roof, clearing the irrigation ditch that had been blocked for months, digging a new well to supplement the creek. Eleanor managed the livestock, the garden, the household. It was a partnership born of necessity, blossoming into mutual respect and affection. They talked more freely now. Jasper spoke of his life before, vaguely, hinting at a restless past, mistakes made, the trouble he had alluded to. He didn't reveal everything. The depths of his past remained shadowed, but he offered enough to build trust, to show her the man beneath the guarded exterior. He had drifted, worked various jobs, seen some of the country. The bullet wound, he finally admitted, came from a misunderstanding, a bar fight that had turned deadly, where he had defended himself but found himself on the wrong side of the law's interpretation. He hadn't killed anyone, he insisted, but he had been forced to run. Eleanor, in turn, spoke more openly about Arthur. She shared memories of their life together, the dreams they had for the ranch, the simple joys they had found in each other's company. She spoke of the ache of his absence, the way the silence had felt like a physical pain. Jasper listened with quiet patience, his presence a soothing balm to the raw edges of her grief. He didn't try to replace Arthur, but he filled the emptiness that Arthur's death had left behind. They didn't speak of a future, not explicitly. His past was still a shadow, a potential threat. Her life here was hard, solitary. But the unspoken possibility hung in the air, warm and fragile. They shared meals across the small cabin table, the lantern light chasing away the shadows, their eyes meeting over steaming mugs of coffee. They sat by the fire in the evenings, Jasper whittling, Eleanor mending or reading, the silence between them no longer a weight, but a shared peace. One night, the wind howling outside, rattling the cabin windows, Eleanor shivered despite the fire. Jasper looked up from his whittling. "Cold?" he asked. "Just the wind," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Sounds lonely tonight." Jasper set down his knife and stood. He walked over to the rough-hewn chest that served as a bench. He hesitated for a moment, then sat beside her on the floor by the fire, closer than they had ever sat before. His shoulder brushed hers. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you just need to know someone else is hearing it too." He didn't offer false comfort, didn't try to chase the loneliness away with empty words. He simply offered his presence, his quiet solidarity. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. It felt right, earned. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind, feeling the warmth of his body beside her. And for the first time in 3 years, the loneliness didn't feel quite so absolute. The season turned. Autumn deepened into winter. The prairie was transformed into a vast landscape of white, the cabin a small island in a sea of snow. The isolation intensified, but it was different now. It was no longer a lonely isolation, but a shared one. They were two against the elements, dependent on each other for survival and comfort. The external conflict hadn't vanished with Caleb McBride's retreat. The townsfolk of Harmony Creek ostracized Eleanor completely. No one visited. When she had to ride into town for supplies, the silence was deafening, the stares palpable. Caleb McBride watched her from his store window, a smug, condemnatory expression on his face. She bought what she needed quickly, her interactions minimal, and rode back to the ranch, back to Jasper and the quiet sanctuary they had built together. Winter brought its own challenges. A severe blizzard trapped them in the cabin for days. They huddled by the fire, rationing food, sharing stories, their lives reduced to the small, warm space between them. It was a test of their patience, their compatibility, their ability to endure hardship together. They passed the test. The forced proximity didn't breed resentment, it deepened their connection. They learned each other's habits, their quiet strengths, their small vulnerabilities. During the blizzard, Eleanor confessed her deepest fear, not of the storm or of outsiders, but of being alone again, of the silence returning, absolute and suffocating. Jasper listened, his blue eyes soft with understanding. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, he reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. His hand was rough, calloused, warm. "You're not alone now, Eleanor," he said quietly, "and you don't have to be." The implicit promise hung in the air, fragile and profound. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but something deeper, a commitment to shared existence, to facing the quiet and the storms together. Spring arrived slowly, hesitantly, melting the snow, turning the prairie from white to brown, then gradually, miraculously, to green. The world outside the cabin opened up again, but their world within remained strong, anchored by the trust and affection that had blossomed in the isolation of winter. With spring came a new challenge, one that wasn't a storm or a judgmental neighbor, but a physical reminder of Jasper's past. A rider, a stranger, appeared on the horizon. He rode with a purpose, scanning the land. He was a man Eleanor had never seen before, lean and hard-faced. He rode directly to the ranch. Eleanor and Jasper were working near the barn when they saw him. Jasper's body tensed instantly. The easy companionship they had shared moments before vanished, replaced by a coiled readiness, a wariness that Eleanor had only seen glimpses of before. "Who is it?" Eleanor asked softly, her hand instinctively going to her throat. "Could be trouble," Jasper said, his gaze fixed on the approaching rider. "Might be. Someone looking for me." The rider reined in his horse a few yards away. He didn't dismount immediately, his eyes sweeping over the ranch, over Eleanor, settling finally on Jasper. There was a cold, assessing look in his eyes. "Shaw," the rider called out, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. "That's me," Jasper replied, stepping forward slightly, placing himself between Eleanor and the newcomer. "Heard you were around," the rider said. "Folks in Harmony Creek talk, said you were laid up out here, figured I'd come collect what's owed." "I don't owe you anything," Jasper said, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe not me directly," the rider countered, a sneer touching his lips. "But the man you laid low in Selena, he had friends, and friends remember." Selena, the bar fight. This was the trouble Jasper had run from, catching up to him here, on Eleanor's doorstep. "It was self-defense," Jasper stated. "Doesn't matter," the rider shrugged. "Justice has a long memory out here, and some folks prefer to deal it out themselves." He glanced at Eleanor, his eyes lingering dismissively. "Didn't figure you for the type to hide behind a woman, Shaw." A dangerous light flickered in Jasper's eyes. "She's not hiding me. She gave me shelter, and she's got nothing to do with this." "Everything's got something to do with it now," the rider said, reaching down to rest his hand on the gun strapped to his thigh. "You come with me, or things get messy. And I don't care who gets caught in the middle." Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her. This was the moment. The past had arrived, threatening to shatter the fragile peace she and Jasper had built. She looked at Jasper, seeing the tension in his jaw, the quiet resolve in his eyes. He wouldn't back down. Before Jasper could reply, Eleanor stepped forward, moving past him, surprising both men. She walked towards the rider's horse, stopping a few feet away. "This is my land," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the yard. "He is here with my permission. He has done nothing wrong here. You have no claim on him on my property." The rider looked at her, surprised by her boldness. He hadn't expected the quiet widow to interfere. "Stay out of it, lady. This is between men." "This is on my land," Eleanor repeated, standing her ground. "And I say you turn around and ride away, now." The rider hesitated, clearly weighing the unexpected complication. He had come for a simple extraction, not a confrontation with a determined woman who clearly had the backing of the man he sought. His eyes narrowed as he looked from Eleanor's unwavering gaze to Jasper's watchful stillness. "He ain't worth it," the rider said, a threat simmering beneath the surface. "Whatever you think you're getting with him, it ain't gonna last. He's trouble." "Maybe he was," Eleanor said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "But people change, and out here on this land he's found his place. He's not leaving." The rider held her gaze for another tense moment. He saw the conviction in her eyes, the quiet strength that radiated from her. He saw Jasper standing silently behind her, ready. He was outnumbered, facing a unified front he hadn't anticipated. The odds weren't in his favor for a quick, clean resolution. With a frustrated grunt, the rider slowly removed his hand from his gun. "This ain't over, Shaw," he said, his eyes fixed on Jasper. "Word gets around. You can't hide out here forever." "I'm not hiding," Jasper said, his voice calm. "I'm home." The rider sneered, but he turned his horse and rode away, disappearing back the way he came, swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. The tension didn't dissipate immediately. Eleanor watched until the rider was a distant speck. Then she turned, her gaze meeting Jasper's. He walked towards her, his expression open for the first time she had seen. The guardedness was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability, a deep gratitude. "You called this place home," Eleanor said softly, testing the words. Jasper reached for her, his rough hands gently cupping her face. His blue eyes searched hers. "Because it is," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Because of you. You gave me a place, Eleanor, a place to heal, a place to be." His thumb gently stroked her cheek. Eleanor leaned into his touch, a wave of emotion washing over her. The years of grief, of loneliness, of hardened resignation seemed to melt away under his touch, under the sincerity in his eyes. "Jasper," she whispered, her own voice trembling. He lowered his head slowly, his gaze never leaving hers, and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or urgency, but one of profound tenderness, of earned connection, of shared vulnerability and quiet hope. It tasted of dust and wind and the promise of spring. The kiss was a quiet turning point, a silent promise exchanged. The threat from Jasper's past remained, a shadow on the horizon, but they would face it together. They had found each other in the vast, empty space of the prairie, two solitary souls drawn together by circumstance and bound by shared hardship and unexpected kindness. Life on the ranch didn't magically become easy. The work remained hard, the elements unforgiving, the isolation from Harmony Creek absolute. But it was no longer a life lived in silence and solitude. It was a life shared, filled with the quiet companionship of two people who had found solace and strength in each other's presence. Jasper stayed. He was true to his word, making her ranch his home. They built a life together, day by day, chore by chore, quiet conversation by quiet conversation. They didn't speak of grand plans, but their actions spoke volumes. He expanded the corral, repaired the barn roof completely, worked the land alongside her with steady patience. She cooked for him, mended his clothes, shared her stories and her quiet strength. The grief for Arthur never completely vanished, but it no longer defined Eleanor. It became a part of her history, a scar she carried, but one that did not prevent her from living, from connecting, from finding a new kind of happiness. Jasper understood her loss, respecting the space Arthur still held in her heart, while carving out his own space alongside it. They learned to navigate the world outside together. When they had to go to Harmony Creek, they went as a pair, facing the cold stares and the whispers side by side. Eleanor no longer felt the need to justify herself. She had made her choice, and she stood by it, and by the man who stood by her. Caleb McBride still glared, but his influence seemed less potent now. Eleanor was no longer the lonely widow to be pitied or judged. She was a woman with a partner, a life she had built on her own terms. The shadow of Jasper's past occasionally resurfaced in unsettling ways, a stranger asking questions at the general store, a rumor of someone looking for him further west, but Jasper was no longer running. He was rooted, anchored by his life with Eleanor. He was ready to face whatever came, knowing he didn't face it alone. One evening, sitting on the porch watching the vast prairie stretch out towards the setting sun, Eleanor leaned her head on Jasper's shoulder. The wind was soft tonight, a gentle whisper across the grasses. "Remember the storm?" she asked softly. "The night you arrived?" "Couldn't forget it," Jasper replied, his arm coming around her. "Thought that was the end of me. And now?" He turned his head, kissing the top of her hair. "Now," he said, his voice filled with a quiet contentment that had replaced the weary guardedness, "now feels like a beginning." Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. The prairie was still vast, still indifferent, still capable of great hardship, but she wasn't facing it alone anymore. The unexpected arrival of a mysterious, wounded stranger had disrupted her life of grief and isolation, forcing her to confront her fears, challenge societal judgment, and ultimately open her heart to the possibility of a new future. He had sought shelter from a storm, and she had offered it, and in the giving and receiving, they had both found something far more precious than just shelter from the wind and rain. They had found a home and belonging in each other. And that, Eleanor knew, had changed her life forever.